firearm, occasionally drinks beer, sometimes plays the state lottery, and lives in a government-inspected and approved house with a government-inspected and approved deck out back. The two live otherwise similar lives, with both being productive, and with neither robbing or assaulting anyone else. Their behaviors, choices, and lifestyles are very similar in almost every way, except that there are laws against the actions of individual A, but not against those of individual B. That alone, without any other substantive difference in what they do or how they treat people, would cause a lot of people to view individual A with a degree of contempt, while viewing individual B with respect and approval. In fact, if individual A was accosted, detained, and even physically assaulted, e.g. tasered, beaten, and handcuffed by law enforcers, even if he had never threatened or harmed anyone, many believers in government would opine that he had it coming and that he deserved to be attacked and caged for having disobeyed the commands of politicians.
This
tendency of onlookers to blame the victims of authoritarian violence is incredibly strong. One who accepts the superstition of authority, the idea that some individuals have the right to forcibly dominate others, and that those others have a duty to comply, will assume that if authority is using violence against a person, it must be justified, and therefore the victim of such violence must have done something wrong. This pattern shows up in different situations. When, for example, U.S. troops kill civilians in some foreign country, many Americans are desperate to believe and therefore automatically assume, without a shred of evidence, that the dead victims must have been insurgents or collaborators, or at least sympathizers with the enemy. As another example, when the Branch Davidians near Waco, Texas were subjected to a military assault, followed by prolonged physical and mental torture, followed by mass extermination, many Americans were quick to assume that anyone that government would do that to must have deserved it. The American tyrants fostered this attitude by fabricating various rumors and accusations in order to demonize the victims of that violent, fascistic assault on nonviolent people. Actually, the incident was the result of a publicity stunt by the ATF, based upon rumors that some people in the group possessed illegal gun parts. Many people assume that if someone was assaulted, prosecuted, or imprisoned by agents of authority, then that person must have done something wrong and must have deserved what was done to them. This assumption may come from a refusal of people to consider the possibility that the government they rely on for protection is actually an aggressor. Or it may come from not wanting to consider the possibility that anyone, including himself, could be the next helpless victim of authoritarian violence, even if he has done nothing wrong. Regardless of the cause, the end result is that when evil is committed in the name of law, many spectators immediately hate the victims and rejoice at the pain and suffering that is inflicted upon them. Obligation to do wrong. While everyone is aware that there are laws against robbery and murder, except when they are committed in the name of authority, the average person is completely unaware of the tens of thousands of pages of other government-issued statutes, rules, and regulations, federal, state, and local. But even when they have very little idea exactly what the law does and does not allow, most people still hold a general belief that obeying the law is a good thing, and that breaking the law is a bad thing. In fact, even when a person is strongly opposed to a particular law, believing it to be unjust, he may still hold a general conflicting belief that laws ought to be obeyed, and that it is justified to punish those who disobey. This psychological paradox is quite common, in fact, with many people vehemently lobbying to change what they view to be bad laws, while supporting the idea that as long as it is the law, people should obey it. Such mental contradictions are common in the context of the belief in authority, but are rare outside of it. For example, no one would argue that it is morally wrong to try to steal an old lady's purse, but also morally wrong for the old lady to hang on to her purse. But the concept of a bad law, in the mind of one who believes in authority, boils down to a similar paradox. A bad command, which also is bad to disobey. The spectator who believes in authority may view a particular command enacted by the masters and implemented by the enforcers as being unimportant, unnecessary, counterproductive, or even stupid or unjust, while at the same time believing that people still have a moral obligation to obey that command, simply because it is the law. Examples of the effects of such a viewpoint abound, ranging from the mundane to the horrific. Here are a few. Number 1. At 2 a.m. on a wide-open, straight, empty road running through unpopulated farmland, a driver slows down but does not stop at the stop sign at a cross street. A motorcycle cop hiding 100 yards away behind some bushes turns on his lights. Almost everyone, given those facts, would agree that the driver did not harm or endanger anyone or anyone's property, and yet most people would agree that the cop would have the right to demand payment from the driver via a traffic ticket. In other words, even though they would concede that the only thing bad about what the driver did was that it was technically illegal, they believe that that alone justifies the forcible robbery of the driver. Taking it one step further, if the driver attempted to leave the scene rather than accept the ticket, most spectators would agree that the cop would be right to chase down, capture, and imprison the driver. Number 2. A government inspector from a state board of health conducts an inspection of a restaurant. The restaurant is perfectly clean and organized, and the inspector finds no indication that anything there poses any risk to anyone's health. However, he nonetheless finds several technical violations of the local code for restaurants. As a result of those violations, not because they create a danger to anyone, but because they are against the rules, the restaurant owner is fined hundreds of dollars. Again, even though the restaurant owner did not harm or endanger anyone or anyone's property, most people would view it as legitimate for the owner to be robbed by those acting on behalf of government. And if the owner attempted to resist such robbery, whether by trying to conceal the technical violations, or bribe the inspector, or by refusing to pay the fine, he would be seen as immoral by most people, and the enforcers would be seen as having the right to use whatever means necessary to achieve compliance with the law. Number 3. A man drives his friend home from a party. Knowing he would have to drive, he did not have any alcohol to drink, though his friend did. He drops his friend off and heads home. He notices the police doing a sobriety checkpoint traffic stop ahead, and remembers that his friend left his half-full beer bottle in the car. Knowing that it is illegal to have an open container of alcohol in his car, he covers it up. He has not harmed or endangered anyone, and in fact has acted quite responsibly, acting as designated driver to make sure his friend would arrive home safely. However, he still broke the law, albeit accidentally, by driving a car with an open bottle of beer in it, and then tried to hide evidence of that fact. If he was caught doing so and arrested, few people would view the cop as the bad guy in the situation. Number 4. A man sells a shotgun with a barrel a quarter of an inch shorter than the law allows. The weapon is no more lethal than a shotgun a quarter of an inch longer, and no one who was involved threatened or used violence against anyone. But the man, having been caught with the illegal item, is subjected to a paramilitary invasion of his property, followed by an armed standoff in which several people are killed. Unfortunately, this example is not hypothetical. It happened to Randy Weaver at the incident at Ruby Ridge in 1992, and he was not merely caught selling an illegal shotgun. He was enticed into doing so by undercover law enforcers. The result of the armed invasion of the Weaver's property and the subsequent shootout and prolonged siege was that Mr. Weaver's wife and son were killed, and he and a friend were wounded. Though it would be absurd for anyone to claim that there is a moral difference between possessing a shotgun with an 18-inch barrel and possessing a shotgun with a 17 3/4-inch barrel, and even though that allegation was the entire legal justification for the armed assault and confrontation, many spectators would still fault Randy Weaver, viewing him as the bad guy for having allowed himself to be coaxed into breaking an arbitrary, completely irrational, not to mention unconstitutional law. That is the power of the belief in authority. It can lead many people to view a gang of sadistic, murderous thugs as the good guys, and to view their victims as the bad guys. To most people, breaking the law without specifying which law has an automatic negative connotation. They view disobedience to authority not merely as dangerous, but as immoral. But to the government believer, something even worse than committing a minor victimless crime is openly disobeying an agent of authority. The average spectator, when observing the interaction between an authority figure and anyone else, will often view with disdain anyone who does not immediately and unquestioningly answer any questions and comply with any requests from a man with a badge. Even if the person complies, but exhibits an attitude towards the authority figure, any attitude other than meek subservience, many spectators will be quick to condemn the one who fails to grovel. And one who runs away from the police, even if he had done nothing wrong in the first place, is viewed with scorn by most. And when someone who runs or hides or refuses to cooperate is beaten up, tortured, or even murdered by law enforcers, many spectators opine that the victim should have done what the police told them to do. And when someone actively resists an authority figure, you have the gumption to take that person's side under any circumstances, even with mere words. Just as a well-trained dog will not bite its master, even when sadistically maltreated, so those who have been trained to bow to authority are usually psychologically incapable of bringing themselves to lift a finger to defend themselves, much less someone else, from any aggression committed in the name of law and government and authority. Indeed, due to their authoritarian indoctrination, most people would more eagerly condemn their fellow victims than join together with their fellow victims to actually resist tyranny. There is, of course, a difference between saying that it is not smart for someone to do something and saying that it is immoral to do something. It is one thing to say that it is stupid for someone to mouth off to a cop, and another to say that doing so is actually immoral, or that one who does so therefore deserves whatever abuse or punishment he receives. The believers in authority often express the latter opinion about anyone who defies the police, regardless of the reason. The idea of average people imposing justice upon wayward law enforcers existentially terrifies statists, even when a law enforcer has done something as serious as committing murder. In the eyes of the well-indoctrinated, the only civilized course of action in such a situation is to beg some other authority to make things right, but never to take the law into one's own hands.
Yeah, he was already talking about it.
And condemn legal injustice, but few are even able to consider the possibility of engaging in premeditated illegal resistance.
Yeah, that was his first example, was Waco.
Government are inflicting vicious brutality upon unarmed, non-violent targets. And if through prolonged brainwashing, a people can be rendered psychologically unable to resist the oppressions done in the name of authority, then it makes no difference whether those people have the physical means to resist.
Breakfast
Modern
coming.
tyrants and their enforcers are always outnumbered and
biscuits
often
and gravy
by their victims by a factor of hundreds or thousands. Yet tyrants still maintain power, not because people lack the physical ability to resist, but because, as a result of their deeply inculcated belief in authority, they lack the mental ability to resist. As Stephen Biko put it, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Double standard on violence. The double standard in the minds of those who have been indoctrinated into authoritarianism when it comes to the use of physical force is enormous.
Yeah, Macduff.
When, for example, a law enforcer is caught on film brutally assaulting an unarmed, innocent person, the talk is usually about whether the officer should be reprimanded or maybe even lose his job. If, on the other hand, some citizen assaults a police officer, nearly everyone will enthusiastically demand, often without even wondering or asking why the person did it, that the person be caged for many years. And if a person resorts to the use of deadly force against a supposed agent of authority, hardly anyone even bothers to ask why he did it. In their minds, no matter what the agent of authority did, it is never okay to kill a representative of the God called government. To the believers in authority, nothing is worse than a cop killer, regardless of why he did it. In reality, using deadly force against one who pretends to be acting on behalf of authority is morally identical to using deadly force against anyone else. An act of aggression does not become any more legitimate or righteous simply because it is legalized and committed by those claiming to act on behalf of authority. And using whatever force is necessary to stop or prevent an act of aggression, whether the aggression is legal or not, and whether the aggressor is a law enforcer or not, is justified. Of course, the risks involved with resisting legal aggression are often much higher, but that does not make it any less moral or justified. Many of the reasons now used by law enforcers to forcibly take people captive, such as engaging in peaceful public demonstrations without a permit, or photographing law enforcers or government buildings, or not submitting to random stops and questioning by law enforcers, have no shred of justification when viewed without the authority myth. As such, resisting such fascist
Got my
thuggery,
OJ too.
even if it requires deadly force to do
juice.
so, is morally justified, albeit extremely dangerous. But most people are literally incapable of even considering such an idea. Even when they recognize unjust oppression, they imagine that the civilized response is to let the injustice happen and then later beg some other authority to make amends. When faced with legal aggression and oppression, there are only two possibilities. Either the people are obliged to allow law enforcers to inflict all manner of injustice and oppression upon them, and then complain later, or the people have the right to use whatever level of force is necessary to stop such injustice and oppression from occurring. To say, for example, that someone has a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures by government agents, as the Fourth Amendment states, would mean nothing if a victim of such tyranny was obliged to allow it to happen at the time and then complain about it later. To have a right to be free from such oppression logically implies the right to use whatever force is required to stop such oppression from happening in the first place, even if that requires the killing of police officers. But the very thought terrifies those who have been trained to always bow to authority. Most of those who speak of unalienable rights still balk at the thought of forcibly defending those rights against authoritarian assaults. To say that someone has a right to do something, while also saying that he would not be justified in forcibly defending such a right against government incursions, is a contradiction. In truth, what most people call rights, they actually perceive as government-granted privileges, which they hope their masters will allow, but which they have no intention of forcibly protecting if such rights are outlawed by government. For example, to have an unalienable right to speak one's mind, the right to freedom of speech, means that the person also has the right to use whatever level of violence it takes, up to and including deadly force, to defend against government agents who try to silence it. Though the point makes loyal believers in authority very uncomfortable, the very concept of a person having an unalienable right to do something also implies the right to kill any law enforcers who attempt to stop him from doing it. But in truth, there is almost nothing that government can do, whether it be censorship, assault, kidnapping, torture, or even murder, which would make the average statist advocate violent, illegal resistance.
And
he is invited to test the depths of his own loyalty.
This is Patrick Smith. Goes by Disenthrall. This is his channel. He's reading a book called from
Law enforcers constantly escalate disagreements to the level of violence. Every time they try to arrest someone or force their way into someone's home or forcibly take someone's property.
Greatest, most dangerous superstition.
Will then keep increasing
name of the book.
level of violence they use until they get their way. The result is that the people, unless they are willing to engage in open revolution against the entire system, will sooner or later bow to the will of the ruling class or be killed. And though the mercenaries of the state are always using force or the threat of force to subdue and subjugate average people, the moment their intended victims respond to violence with violence, most spectators will instantly identify the victim of aggression, the one who used force only to defend against an attack, as the bad guy. This glaring double standard, the idea that the Jews
always drops off through here.
Germany should have continued to try to work within the system by voting and petitioning the Third Reich for justice. Instead, those who illegally hid, ran away, or even forcibly resisted, as occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto, are now seen by almost everyone as having been justified in doing so, even though they were technically criminals, lawbreakers, and even cop killers. But authoritarians in their own time and in their own country not only continue to condemn any who illegally try to avoid or resist oppression, but cheerfully gloat over the suffering of such people when they are punished by government. To delight in a tax cheat being punished, for example, as many Americans do, is akin to a slave taking pleasure in the whipping of a fellow slave who tried to escape. There may be an aspect of simple envy in this, a feeling that if one subject has been victimized, it is not fair that another escapes such suffering. This contributes to the fact that taxpayers, i.e. those who have been forcibly extorted by the ruling class, often express resentment of anyone who has avoided being similarly extorted. Oddly, the victims of legal robbery often imagine themselves to be virtuous for having been robbed, and look down on those who, for whatever reason, have not been robbed. The danger of inaction. One who views breaking the law as inherently bad, regardless of what the law is, may be quick to report to the authorities any illegal activities he is aware of, even if the activities are victimless and constitute neither force nor fraud. Likewise, those who sit on juries in government courtrooms, if they imagine disobedience to authority, breaking the law, to be inherently immoral, are likely to give their blessing to someone being punished, sometimes quite harshly, for doing something which harmed no one and did not constitute either fraud or violence. In the case of the snitch and the juror, however, such actions take one out of the role of a mere spectator and move him into the role of a collaborator of oppression. The damage done by the belief in authority among the spectators of oppression comes more often from their inaction rather than from their action. Time after time, oppressions large and small have been committed right under the noses of basically good people who did nothing about it, because he fears for his own safety. But the Milgram experiments showed quite clearly that even without an underlying threat to themselves, most people feel irresistibly compelled to obey authority, even when they know that what they're being told to do is wrong and harmful to others. And if they find it difficult to disobey a perceived authority, they will find it even more difficult, if not impossible, to bring themselves to intervene when an authority is exerting its will on someone else. The result of the spectators, having been trained to be passive, obedient, and non-confrontational, can be seen in the many instances throughout the world and throughout history of dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of spectators standing around like zombies watching as agents of authority assault or murder innocent people. Even in the United States, the supposed land of the free and home of the brave, videos continue to surface depicting police brutality occurring right in front of crowds of onlookers who simply stand and watch, not lifting a finger to protect their fellow man against the evils committed in the name of authority. Part 3E, the effects of the myth on the advocates. Legalized aggression. While most people probably imagine themselves to be spectators when it comes to authoritarian oppression and injustice, in truth, nearly everyone is actually an advocate of government violence in one form or another. Anyone who votes, regardless of the candidate or even verbally supports some policy or program of the government, is condoning the initiation of violence against his neighbors, even if he does not recognize it as such. This is because law is not about friendly suggestions or polite requests. Every so-called law enacted by politicians is a command, backed by the threat of violence against those who do not obey. As George Washington put it, government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Most people in their day-to-day lives are very reluctant to use threats or physical force against their fellow man. Only a tiny fraction of the many personal disagreements that occur lead to violent conflicts. However, because of their belief in government, nearly everyone advocates widespread violence without even realizing it. And they feel no guilt about doing so, because they perceive threats and coercion to be inherently legitimate when they are called law enforcement. Everyone knows what happens if someone gets caught breaking the law. It may only be a fine, a demand for payment under threat of force, or it may be an arrest, forcibly taking someone captive, or it may even result in law enforcers killing someone who continues to resist. But every law is a threat, backed by the ability and willingness to use deadly force against those who disobey, and anyone who honestly considers the idea will recognize that fact. But the belief in authority leads to a strange contradiction in how people see the world. Almost everyone advocates that law be used to coerce others to do certain things or to fund certain things. However, while advocating such violence, knowing full well the consequences to any who are caught disobeying, those same advocates fail to recognize that what they are advocating is violence. There are millions, for example, who consider themselves to be peaceful, civilized people. Some even proudly wear the label of pacifist, while advocating armed robbery against everyone they know, as well as millions of strangers. They see no contradiction, because the robbery is given the euphemism taxation, and is carried out by people who are imagined to have the right to commit robbery in the name of government. The level of denial which the belief in authority creates is profound. When advocating political violence, people accept no responsibility for the results. Those who apply for government benefits, for example, are asking to receive loot forcibly stolen from their neighbors via taxation. Likewise, applying for a government job amounts to asking that one's neighbors be forced to pay one's salary. Whether the person receives a direct payment or some service, program, or other benefit, he will usually accept the stolen property without the slightest hint of shame or guilt. He may otherwise be perfectly neighborly to the people whom he asked the state to rob. In no other situation does such a strange mental disconnect occur, not only for the one advocating the act of aggression, but also for the victim of it. If, for example, one person had paid an armed thief to break into his neighbor's house and steal some of his valuables, and the neighbor knew he had done so, such neighbors would probably not be on friendly terms, to say the least. Yet when the same thing is done using authority, via elections followed by legislative theft, neither the thief nor the victim usually perceives anything wrong with it. Authors personally,
On mobile, I can't
I've
click
lost
on
count
things.
of how many people have expressed sympathy for me and my wife because we
Send
were
that
in
link to
prison
my email,
for
please.
not bowing to the IRS. But it never seems to occur to our non-anarchist acquaintances that we
When I
were
get on
paid
desktop at
by
work,
the very people
I'll play
they
it.
voted for disobeying commands which they advocated. As far as I know, not one statist we know has even noticed the schizophrenia and hypocrisy of actively supporting mass extortion, taxation, and then giving heartfelt condolences to the victims of that same extortion. One can see the supernatural essence of authority in the fact that among the people who will eagerly vote for their neighbors to be legally extorted and robbed, few would ask or pay mere mortals to do the same thing. Few people would feel justified in hiring a street gang to rob his neighbors in order to pay for his own child's schooling. But many millions advocate the same thing when they condone property taxes to fund public schools.
I'll be able to bring
Why
it up
do the
after
two feel so morally
processes
different to them? Because those who believe in government believe it
Chat
consists
takes
of
forever to
something
come
more
back.
than the people in it. It is imagined to have rights that no mere mortal has. From the perspective of the statist, asking government to do something has far more in common
bring it up
with
on my other
praying
phone.
for the gods to do something than it does with asking people to do something. A statist who demands certain legislation would be horrified and offended if some group of average people offered to provide similar services. Imagine if a street gang made the following offer to a local resident. We'll do a shakedown of your neighbors and use what we get to pay for things you want. Your kid going to school, fixing the roads, stuff like that. We have to keep a cut ourselves, of course, and tell us how you wish your neighbors would behave and we'll make sure they behave that way. If they don't do what we say, we'll take their stuff or stick them in a cage. If average people made such an offer, they would be condemned for their attempted thuggery. But when the same things are proposed in a campaign speech by someone running for a position in government, and when such things are done in the name of vague political abstractions such as the common good or the will of the people, they are seen not only as allowable, but as noble and virtuous. When the politician says, we need to provide adequate funding for our children's education, and we need to invest in our infrastructure, he is literally talking about forcibly taking money away from the people via taxes and spending it the way he thinks it should be spent. Such aggression is accepted as justified when done in the name of authority, but recognized as immoral if done by mere mortals. This shows that in the mind of the statist, government is something more than a collection of human beings. Paradoxically, the statist will insist that everything that government is allowed to do, and everything it is, comes from the people. All belief in government requires the absurd, cult-like belief that, by way of
Not a message
pseudo-religious
retracting
political
going on.
documents and rituals, constitutions, elections, appointments, legislation, and so on, a bunch of mere mortals can conjure into existence an entity that possesses superhuman rights. rights not possessed by any of the people who created it. And once the people hallucinate the existence of such a thing, they will eagerly beg that thing to forcibly control and extort their neighbors. People recognize that mere mortals have no right to do such things, but truly believe that the deity called government has every right to do such things. Excuses for aggression. Though democracy is often praised as the height of civilization, cooperation, and getting along, it is the exact opposite. Voting is an act of aggression, and loving democracy amounts to loving widespread violence and constant conflict. Political elections are not about togetherness, unity, or tolerance. They are about arguing over how everyone should be forced to behave and what everyone should be forced to financially support via the control machine called government. The abundance of campaign signs littering lawns prior to every election are not the sign of an enlightened, free society. They are the sign of a mentally and physically enslaved society, bickering over which slave master they want holding the whip. Every single person who votes, Democrat, Republican, or third party, is attempting to put people into power who will carry out large-scale extortion, taxation, to fund various government programs. Any candidate who suggested doing away with all such robbery entirely, repealing all taxes, would be ridiculed as an extremist kook. All voters attempt to empower a gang they know will commit mass robbery, yet none of those voters accept any responsibility for doing so. They know what their candidates will do if put into power. They know what the consequences will be to any who then disobey the commands of those politicians. But the belief in authority makes the voters psychologically incapable of recognizing that what they are doing is advocating widespread violence. In fact, notwithstanding the traditional mythology and rhetoric, no one who believes in government actually wants it to be administered with these.
I'm gonna have to go look at Nightbot dashboard after this stream just to see all these messages that are being retracted.
Consent, it would mean that
I'm not seeing them come across the first time because I'm driving.
Upon himself, unless others happen to advocate the exact same agenda. Obviously, the goal of the voter is not to compel himself to financially support things he likes, nor is it to control his own choices and behaviors. The goal of every voter is always to use the mechanism of government to coerce other people into making certain choices, funding certain things, and behaving in certain ways. Indeed, the individual statist sometimes has a fairly lax view of his own obligation to obey the myriad of political commands, laws, feeling that he is competent to rely on his own common sense and judgment regardless of the law, while at the same time feeling that everyone else needs to be controlled and micromanaged by authority. He believes that he himself is trustworthy and moral, and can make his own decisions, and that the purpose of the law is to keep everyone else in line. The degree to which different voters want authority controlling others varies significantly. The constitutionalist wants the federal government to force others to fund only those things specifically designated as federal matters by the U.S. Constitution.
All right, when we get near the border, it's going to disconnect again, usually.
To force others to fund all sorts of things, from art to defense, to caring
so we get past the Jeep plant,
education, to retirement programs, and so on, ad infinitum. But while the two types of voters may differ in the degree and types of aggression they support, they do not differ in principle. They have both accepted the premise that authority has the right to forcibly extort money for government functions that are deemed necessary. They differ only on what counts as necessary. The thinking of almost every statist is paradoxical. On the one hand, statists know that every law they condone is a command backed by a threat of violence. They are fully aware of the things that are done to any lawbreaker who gets caught. But the average statist, when asked, will vehemently deny that he condones the initiation of violence against his neighbors. On a practical level, the statist knows that any political agenda he supports will, if enacted, be administered by whatever level of intimidation or brute force is necessary.
That's the Jeep plant up ahead on the left.
Yet the average statist, while being fully aware of this, will also exhibit a huge logical disconnect, refusing to admit that he is openly and directly advocating the forcible extortion and coercive control of millions of innocent people. The reason for this is that the statist believes that the entity called authority has the right to rule, and as a result, when it commits violence, it doesn't count as violence. As long as the violence is done by those claiming to be authority, who are imagined to have an exemption from the usual rules of morality, don't steal, don't assault, don't murder, etc., even those who are the most ardent proponents of various taxes and other laws can continue to imagine themselves to be peaceful, compassionate, non-violent people. Some even imagine themselves to be pacifists, because everything government does is done via force or threat of force. There is no such thing, and can be no such thing, as a statist pacifist. While obviously not all anarchists are pacifists, all true pacifists are anarchists. There are many ways, a few of which are addressed below,
That's
in
an
which
interesting
otherwise
thing.
decent, virtuous people condone aggression and assault.
I guess by
intimidation
definition he's
and
right.
robbery, because they believe that it is perfectly allowable for the superhuman, mythical deity known as government to commit such acts, and therefore believe that it is perfectly moral and virtuous for them to ask government to commit such acts. Charity through violence. The typical statist is profoundly schizophrenic, being both completely aware and completely unaware that he personally advocates the widespread use of violence against others. A dramatic example of this would be those who view themselves as loving and compassionate for supporting government programs to help the poor. What they are literally advocating via their support of welfare programs is a massive extortion racket in which many millions of human beings are robbed of billions of dollars via the threat of being caged. Proponents of such charity through violence imagine themselves to be virtuous and caring because of what the needy may receive, while completely disassociating themselves from the threats, intimidation, harassment, forced seizures and imprisonments which they know occur and which they know are essential to any welfare program. Because of this bizarre selective denial, those who believe in government can be totally aware of the brute force by which such laws are implemented, while being seemingly unaware that they themselves are condoning such brute force when they demand such laws. The belief in authority is what allows for this strange psychological contradiction, as it convinces the advocates of wealth redistribution schemes that the victims of legal extortion have an obligation to cooperate, and that the use of violence against those who do not pay their taxes is therefore justified. As a result, the basic measure of morality and virtue is turned completely on its head, with welfare advocates viewing themselves as compassionate for advocating violent theft, while viewing as despicable criminals any who try to avoid or resist that violence. Similarly, advocates of Social Security, a Ponzi-style wealth redistribution scheme, imagine themselves to be caring and compassionate. Blinded by their belief in government, they fail to recognize that they are not only forcing people into what is falsely represented as a government-run retirement scheme, but are also adding insult to injury by insinuating that people cannot and should not be trusted to plan for their own futures. It takes a serious disconnect with
Downer
reality
doesn't know them
for
anymore.
someone to vehemently support coercing people into participating in an investment program which invests in nothing and has no assets, and which has a return far worse than most real investments, and actually does not guarantee any return at all. And then to feel noble and charitable for having forced people into such a scheme. Not only is there no Social Security account individually or collectively that is paid into, but the U.S. Supreme Court in Fleming v. Nestor, 363 U.S. 603, has made it clear that no one has any contractual rights to any Social Security benefits at all, regardless of how much they may have paid into the system, and that Congress can cut off any or all benefits anytime it wants. Advocates of brutality. Quite often throughout history, heinous oppression has been supported by the people in part because the people were unable to recognize evil as evil when it was committed in the name of law and authority. If the people truly believe that government has the
that
right
was
to
the state
rule,
line.
as almost everyone now believes,
I haven't seen
all
any,
sorts
actually.
of authoritarian solutions will be supported, or at least passively accepted by most people. For
I don't have the
example,
scanner going
many
though.
Germans in the 1940s, who themselves would never commit or condone private intimidation or assault, much less murder, nonetheless eagerly supported.
Usually
the
they're
idea
sitting right
of
there
a
at the border,
legislative
but
government
there's none there
approved
today.
and government-administered solution to the so-called Jewish problem, as Hitler called it. It was officially sanctioned and done via law, so the people imagined themselves to be blameless for whatever happened, even if they vehemently advocated.
For whatever reason, it's good.
Americans today, suffering from selective denial, are quick to righteously condemn what other violent, oppressive regimes have done.
Road pirates are busy doing something else.
As a result of their own belief in authority, they too condone widespread draconian brutality in the name of law. Even when oppression goes beyond mere threats and intimidation, it leads to constant, widespread, open violence and brutality. Most people, as a result of their belief in authority, are still unable to recognize it as evil. An obvious example is war. The nationalism that is so strong in authoritarians blinds them to the absolute evil which they condone and support in the name of national defense. In many cases, this blindness is intentional. Politicians and conservative voters alike complain when the blunt realities of war are shown to the American people. They want to wave their flag and cheer for their team, enthusiastically participating in the pack mentality. But they do not want to have to actually see the real-world results of what it is they support. They can be persuaded to proudly.
That's where the imaginary line is. That's why I call it the border.
As long as they are sheltered from having to see the carnage, blood, guts, and body parts which their patriotism is causing. Though love of one's country is still portrayed as a great virtue, the truth is that the killers on both sides of every war, including those who fought for the most brutal, ruthless regimes in history, have been motivated by the feeling of righteousness that nationalistic pack mentality gives them. War could not happen at all without soldiers putting their devotion and loyalty to their own gang, tribe, or country above doing what is right. Patriotism and the belief in authority are the two key ingredients to war.
Yep.
The easiest way to dupe basically good people into committing evil is by portraying acts of aggression and conquest as fighting for one's country. While rulers have long been practicing mind control over their subjects, in many cases the mind control of those who believe in authority is self-inflicted. They want to believe in their country and in some righteous abstract principle, some ideal, some noble cause, i.e. spreading democracy, without having to think of what is happening in simple, literal terms. It is easier to...
Because the magic spells change from one state to the next. That's why I consider it a border.
Mentality terminology. It allows its proponents...
Even the speed that we can travel without breaking the magic spells changes.
While individual soldiers may truly believe they are fighting for a noble cause, it is impossible to be a good guy and be at war with an entire country, as discussed previously. The way governments wage war is never justified and never moral, as it always involves widespread violence against innocents.
Left Ohio, now we're in Michigan. I work in Michigan, so just over the border.
Another example of modern draconian brutality, legally committed in the free world, comes from
11 miles in,
violence known as the war on drugs. In the name of trying to stamp out a habit, not violence or theft or fraud, but a mere habit, millions of non-violent, peaceful, productive human beings have been assaulted. Terrorized, and caged. Enforcement of narcotics laws occurs in a particularly brutal, vicious way, with paramilitary invasions of private homes being commonplace and many-year imprisonments for victimless crimes being abundant. And the advocates of the war on drugs are well aware, not only of the overtly violent enforcement actions, but also of the fact that the only measurable effects have been higher prices for certain mind-altering substances, more crime committed to pay for such substances, violent conflict between rival sellers of the substances, and more funds, weapons, power, and legislative permission for those who wear the label of authority to harass and assault innocents. Even if it actually worked and eliminated or significantly reduced the use of certain drugs, such brutality would be absolutely unjustified and immoral. But even though it has utterly failed to get an inch closer to the stated goal,
doesn't even look like that's open.
Enthusiastically cheer for more harassment, terrorism, and violence. To add hypocrisy to fascism,
are we blessed with a day off with no policing? Wouldn't that be nice?
Morally identical to the behaviors they want authority to violently stamp out. And while millions of lives continue to be destroyed by that brutal draconian crusade, many statists eagerly blame the victims by declaring that they broke the law and therefore deserve whatever is done to them. So, to the supposedly moral and responsible conservative, even if a person has harmed no one and committed neither force nor fraud, if he has simply disobeyed the arbitrary decrees of his masters,
Is
he
it?
deserves to be
Oh yeah,
assaulted,
President's Day, and our
or
president is
and of course, such
going to pick up his
conservatives
10%
the targets
for the big
of
guy
fascist
in Ukraine.
sides to fight back. From the twisted, delusional viewpoint of the devout nationalist authoritarian, it is noble and virtuous for state mercenaries to violently assault and attempt to kidnap and cage a productive, peace-loving pot smoker, but heinously evil for that pot smoker to use violence to defend himself against such aggression. Such is the insanity caused by the superstition of authority. Forced benefits. Statists often defend taxation by arguing that the forced confiscation of wealth by government becomes retroactively justified when some of the confiscated money is spent in a way that benefits the one from whom the money was taken, or at least benefits society in general. For example, the statist may argue that if someone drives on a road that was funded in part by money taken from that person, or indirectly benefits from others being able to...
You think it's because they're mad,
then that
really?
person should not complain about having been taxed to fund it. Ignoring the true nature of the situation, statists mischaracterize this as simply paying for services. No one would make a similar argument when authority is not involved. Suppose, for example, that a restaurant delivered a meal to someone who had not ordered it, and then sent over armed thugs to collect $100 from that person. If the person, after being extorted in that way, chose to eat the meal, no rational person would argue that that would make the restaurant's actions morally acceptable. Yet that is exactly analogous to the usual view of statists, that if someone benefits from government services, he should not complain about taxes. The unstated premise is that legal robbery is perfectly legitimate as long as authority afterwards provides some benefit to the one who was robbed. And it seems to make little difference to statists whether such a benefit is only indirect, or is horrendously expensive, or is combined with all other sorts of things which do not benefit the person at all, or which the person morally opposes, e.g. funding war or abortion or some religious or anti-religious agenda. This is because statists believe that ultimately it is the prerogative of those in authority, not of those who earned the money, to decide how wealth should be spent. And that as long as the ruling class claims to be robbing and controlling the people for their own good, the peasants have no right to resist whatever coercion and violence the masters deem necessary.
I'm not going to presume to know the exact reason why they're doing it.
Of the notion that government providing benefits retroactively
I can guarantee you that the stated reasons aren't it from either side.
It is necessary for the people to be forcibly controlled and robbed so that government can protect them from the bad people who might otherwise forcibly control and rob
A
them.
long history between those two
This
places.
absurd, contorted rationalization is quite common whether the discussion relates to an authoritarian military or domestic law enforcement. And statists rely on fear-mongering to bolster such lunacy, making dire predictions about all the unpleasant things they theorize would occur if the people were not forcibly robbed via a massive authoritarian extortion racket. Again, such silly arguments are never made in situations where authority is not involved. No one would accept a claim that it is okay for a restaurant to force someone to pay for food he did not order on the grounds that otherwise the person might starve. No one would accept a claim that it is okay for a builder to force someone to pay for a building he did not order on the grounds that otherwise the person might be homeless. But even more ridiculous would be to claim that it is okay for one street gang to run a protection racket so that they have the resources to keep all the other dangerous street gangs out of their city. Yet that is exactly the attempted justification for all government, that it must be allowed to commit aggression against everyone so that it can protect them from others who might commit aggression against them. Supporters of a strong police force or a powerful military, both of which are funded via forced confiscation of wealth, have accepted the premise that it is not only okay, but necessary for people to be oppressed.
There we go.
And
First
extorted by
oppression.
government. as long as it is done for their own
Monroe
good.
County
The
Sheriff.
fact that authoritarian protectors fail to prevent crime or war and instead dramatically increase both via warmongering and creating illegal markets seems to go unnoticed by those who advocate defense via government. Again, it is only because authority is imagined to have the right to commit aggression that anyone would ever make the inane argument that it is proper to initiate violence against people in order to protect them. When in doubt, advocate violence. Much of the time, people will even advocate a forcibly imposed authoritarian plan simply because they are not sure what would happen if they did not, or are not sure how something would be accomplished if people were left in freedom. For example, if someone has a hard time picturing how a completely private road system would function, he will usually advocate a government plan funded by coercion. If he is not sure how well
somebody
free
pulled
people
over on the side of the
defend
road.
themselves without a
Or
standing army,
the little
he
parking
will
lot
likely
there.
advocate an authoritarian military solution funded by coercive taxation. Those who believe in government advocate violence by default. All it takes is a little uncertainty and ignorance to cause the average person to advocate a coercive government plan for just about anything. This is not how people behave in their day-to-day lives. The average person does not go around initiating violence against everyone he meets because he is not sure that everyone he meets will otherwise behave properly and make the right decisions. But that is precisely what most statists do via government. They advocate the widespread, forcible control of millions of human beings simply because they are not entirely sure that people, if left in freedom, would spend their money the way they should, treat others the way they should, find peaceful, effective solutions to problems, etc. By way of the superstition of authority, statists can comfortably advocate the violent subjugation of their neighbors simply because they are not quite sure how their neighbors would otherwise behave. And those who crave power exploit that fact to their advantage. All the politician needs to do in order to get support for an authoritarian power grab is to tell the public that things might not work very well if he left people in freedom. He does not even need to wait until someone actually does something dishonest or malicious or negligent or otherwise destructive. All he has to do is suggest the possibility that if the people are left in freedom, bad things might happen. Because advocates of government violence do not recognize law as violence, the threshold at which they will support an authoritarian coerced solution is very low. Those who crave power can simply suggest that some plan might help someone somewhere, and many people will condone legal violence based upon that premise alone. A lot of government violence is based upon guesses about what might happen as a result of what people might do. For example, much of the state coercion done in the name of environmentalism.
That girl that opened that door, nobody got out, but she took off with the door open and it slammed shut.
Because otherwise people might make
they might be having an argument
to global warming, the end of the rainforests, the extinction of animals, and so on. Few people acting on their own would commit aggression based upon a guess about possible indirect consequences of the non-malicious, non-violent actions of others. Yet that is commonplace in government policy. As another example of advocating government violence by default, consider the practice of forcibly preventing foreigners from setting foot anywhere in an entire country without the written permission of the ruling class of that country. Such immigration laws create something akin to the war mentality, where an entire demographic category of people is criminalized and demonized and subjected to acts of aggression based upon concerns about what some of those people might do. People opine that many illegals are criminals or come into the country
that happened
just to
behind
receive
me.
benefits. Regardless of how often such allegations are accurate, the result is that all illegals, anyone who is in the country without the permission of the politicians, are forcibly controlled. This is the result of pack mentality guilt by association. It should go without saying that using violence against one person because he is of the same race or from the same country or in some other way similar to someone else who has actually caused harm is utterly unjustified. Of note, the attempts by government to quell illegal immigration also result in aggression being perpetrated against many legal residents as well as illegals at border patrol checkpoints, many of which are not even at the borders. To stop and question everyone driving down a road because someone might be there illegally is precisely the kind of unjustified aggression commonly committed by government agents and rarely committed by anyone else. This violence by default can also be seen in the intrusive searches and interrogations of anyone who attempts to fly on a plane in the land of the free. For the owner of a plane to put conditions on anyone who wants to ride in his plane, and this would also apply to a train, a car, or anything else, is very different from a third party forcibly preventing anyone from riding on any plane anywhere in an entire country, unless the would-be passengers first subject themselves to questioning, searches of their luggage, and even strip searches of themselves by the agents of the third party. People would never tolerate any private individual behaving in this way with the attitude of, I'd better force my will on everyone else, just in case. But for agents of authority, the tactic is commonplace, and people imagine it to be legitimate. In fact, they often demand that authority do such things. In their day-to-day lives, nonviolence is the default type of behavior for most people. While there are occasional physical conflicts, most people go to great lengths to avoid them, not only by trying not to start a fight, but also by trying to diffuse tense situations. Even when a fight does occur, both sides usually end up walking away. Each day, billions of people find
All right,
ways to
we'll
peacefully
pick this
coexist,
back up
even
later.
when they have
I'm going to
significantly
shut it
different
down
viewpoints,
till
beliefs, and
about
attitudes. But that is in their
quarter
personal
after
lives.
the
When it
hour.
comes to politics,
I should
violence
start
is
up
the
a
default.
desktop stream.
Every voter, to one extent or another, seeks to
All
have
right,
his
if you wanna
own
join
views
me,
and ideas forcibly inflicted upon
We'll do some
everyone
reviews.
else
We'll see
through
what's
the
been playing
mechanism
over
of
the
government.
weekend. I really haven't done
The
much. I didn't
default
stream
is
yesterday.
not to let others do their own thing, or
So there's plenty to get caught up on. Thanks for riding with me. Peace. Oops.